The bridge that should not have stood. 7th of March, 1945. 1500 hours. Remagen, Germany. Major James Mitchell, intelligence officer of the 1st Army's 3rd Armored Division, stood at the western approach of the Ludendorff Bridge, his gloved hands trembling as he examined a sheaf of German demolition orders captured from a Wehrmacht signals bunker. The documents, stamped with the seal of Army Group B headquarters, contained detailed instructions for the bridge's destruction, complete with charge placements, detonation sequences, and firing times calibrated to the minute. Every contingency had been planned. Every scenario anticipated. Every calculation checked and rechecked by German engineers who understood that this bridge, more than almost any other, absolutely could not fall into Allied hands intact. Mitchell read the demolition schedule again, his breath forming clouds in the cold March air. The charges were to be blown when Allied forces reached a line precisely 2 kilometers west of the bridge, at coordinates that American units had crossed more than 30 minutes ago. "This can't be right," he muttered, looking up at the railroad bridge that still spanned the Rhine, its dark iron trusses stark against the gray sky. They had every chance, every warning, every reason. What Mitchell didn't know, as he stood there trying to reconcile German thoroughness with German failure, was that this bridge represented not a miracle of American speed or courage, but something far more significant. A truth about the collapse of German military capability so complete that it would take him weeks to fully comprehend its magnitude. The small explosion that had damaged the bridge when the 9th Armored Division first rushed across had been too little, too late. A desperate last gesture that only emphasized the magnitude of the failure. Someone had tried to blow the bridge at the last possible moment. But by then, command had broken down so thoroughly that even this final act of destruction had been botched. As Mitchell watched American tanks and trucks rolling across the span in an unbroken stream, he felt the first stirrings of a realization that would transform his understanding of the entire campaign. Perhaps the entire war itself. The mathematics were staggering. Within 24 hours of the bridge's capture, 4 divisions, roughly 48,000 men with their full equipment trains, would cross into the bridgehead. Within a week, the number would exceed 200,000. The tonnage of supplies flowing across the single span approached 15,000 tons per day, a figure that represented more material than the entire German 15th Army defending this sector had received in the previous month. The disparity wasn't tactical. It wasn't even strategic. It was existential. But the bridge was merely a symptom. As Mitchell would discover in the documents, prisoner interrogations, and field reports that would cross his desk in the coming weeks, the German army west of the Rhine hadn't been defeated so much as it had dissolved. Where German planning documents called for divisions with strength of 15,000 men, Mitchell found actual unit strengths of 2,000, 3,000, sometimes as few as 800. Where supply plans assumed daily rations of 3,000 calories per man and ammunition expenditures of 100 rounds per rifle per day, actual deliveries amounted to a fraction. The Wehrmacht was defending against the most powerful military force ever assembled with an army that existed primarily on paper and in the increasingly desperate orders flowing from Berlin. Mitchell had arrived at Remagen by chance, dispatched from 1st Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, to assess the intelligence value of captured German documents in the rapidly expanding bridgehead. He was 34 years old, a graduate of Yale and the Army War College. Fluent in German through a childhood spent in Berlin, where his father had worked in the American diplomatic service before the war. Before transferring to intelligence, he had commanded an infantry company through North Africa and Sicily, earning a Silver Star at Gela when his understrength unit held off a German counterattack for 11 hours. He understood ground combat. He understood German military doctrine. He thought he understood what the Allies faced in crossing the Rhine. The conventional wisdom, repeated in every planning session and briefing Mitchell had attended since the Ardennes offensive, held that the Rhine represented Germany's last natural defensive barrier, that German forces would defend it with fanatical determination, that crossing it would require massive preparation and careful coordination, and would likely cost tens of thousands of casualties. British Field Marshal Montgomery's planned assault north of the Ruhr involved 25 divisions, a preparatory bombardment of 2 weeks, and airborne drops on a scale approaching D-Day itself. Eisenhower's staff estimated casualties for the Rhine crossings could exceed 50,000 men. The terrain, the river's width and current, the expected German resistance, all the factors pointed to a campaign measured in months. Mitchell had believed this too. Every indicator suggested it. German radio traffic still maintained operational security. German artillery still fired regularly. German positions on the East Bank appeared well prepared, with trenches, bunkers, and cleared fields of fire visible through binoculars. The propaganda broadcasts from Berlin promised that the Reich would fight for every meter of German soil, that the Rhine would run red with Allied blood, that new weapons and fresh divisions would hurl the invaders back. Mitchell had written intelligence estimates assuming German divisions, though battered, still maintained cohesion and combat effectiveness. The German logistics, though strained, could still support sustained defensive operations. The German officers he had interrogated in Belgium and eastern France had been confident, even cocky. A Wehrmacht captain captured near St. Vith in January had told Mitchell, "You have not seen what we have waiting for you at the Rhine. You think we are beaten, but Germany is strongest when defending her own soil." A colonel from a panzer division, captured during the Ardennes collapse, had warned, "The Rhine is not France. The Rhine is Germany. Every German soldier will fight like 3 men when defending the fatherland." These men had seemed sincere, true believers in Germany's capacity for continued resistance. But the bridge at Remagen shouldn't have been standing. That was the anomaly that wouldn't stop bothering Mitchell as he organized the intelligence materials seized by advancing American units. The Germans had held bridges at Nijmegen in Holland for weeks under direct Allied assault. German engineers had demonstrated time and again their thoroughness and their willingness to destroy valuable infrastructure to delay Allied advances. Yet here, at one of the most critical crossings of the most important river in Germany, with detailed demolition plans in place and advance warning of the American approach, the bridge had survived. Mitchell climbed into the signals bunker where the documents had been found, a concrete shelter built into the hillside overlooking the western approach. The bunker was well constructed, properly ventilated, equipped with telephone lines to multiple headquarters. It was not some improvised position. This was part of an integrated defensive system. Yet the German signals troops had abandoned it without destroying their equipment or files. Mitchell found the duty log still open on a wooden table. The last entry timed at 12:45 hours, just 15 minutes before American tanks reached the bridge approach. The entry read simply, "All circuits to East Bank interrupted. Artillery fire observed on bridge deck. Request instructions." Below it, blank pages. "They just stopped," said Lieutenant Frank Cordell, the signals intelligence officer who had taken charge of the captured documents. Cordell was 26, a former high school mathematics teacher from Iowa who had learned German from his grandmother. Not a systematic withdrawal. They just stopped functioning. Mitchell picked up a folder marked Fernsbruck Log, telephone message log, and began reading entries from the previous week. What he found there would become the first piece of a puzzle whose full scope would take weeks to comprehend. The log recorded increasingly desperate communications between the bridge command, local Wehrmacht units, and higher headquarters. A message dated 1st of March requested replacement charges for the bridge demolitions, noting that moisture had compromised some of the existing explosives. The response, received on 3rd of March. Request noted. Supplies en route. Another exchange, on 5th of March. Engineer Company reports 50% shortage of personnel for demolition detail due to reassignments. Request immediate replacement or guidance on reduced security procedures. Response. Maintain existing schedule. Replacements to follow. But the replacements never came. The supplies never arrived. By 6th of March, the log showed frantic messages. American units observed crossing at Auskirchen. Request immediate authority to execute demolition plan if enemy approaches. Standing orders require Corps authorization. The authorization apparently never came through, or came too late, or was contradicted by other orders. The last entries showed a command structure that had ceased to function. Not collapsed dramatically, but simply stopped working, like a motor running out of fuel. There's more, Cordell said, handing Mitchell another folder. Personal diary, found it in the commander's quarters in town. The diary belonged to Major Klaus Scheller, the Wehrmacht officer responsible for the bridge's defense and demolition. Scheller's entries, written in precise Gothic script, provided a window into the disintegration of German command. The entry for 28th of February recorded, received notification that the 105th Grenadier Regiment, assigned to secure the West Bank approaches, has been reduced from 3 battalions to 1 understrength battalion due to casualties and transfers. We are now expected to defend the same sector with 1/3 the planned force. The Herr Oberst assures me that additional units will arrive before any serious threat develops. 1st of March. The promised replacements have not appeared. Telephone inquiries to division headquarters go unanswered for hours. When connection is finally made, staff officers seem confused about which units are assigned to this sector. There is discussion of new defensive lines, new boundaries, new plans, but nothing definite. Meanwhile, American artillery grows louder each day. 3rd of March. Supplies have not arrived. The engineer detachment reports that some of the bridge charges are in questionable condition. They require replacement or supplemental explosives. I have sent 3 requests to Corps, marked urgent. No response. The supply officer tells me the rail line from Koblenz was bombed yesterday. He does not know when service will resume. I have sent a truck convoy to fetch the necessary materials, but they must navigate roads under constant Allied air attack. 5th of March. The truck convoy has not returned. Telephone lines to Corps headquarters have been cut and cannot be repaired. Our signals troops lack the necessary cable. Radio communication is sporadic due to Allied jamming. I have sent a motorcycle courier with a written request for authorization to execute the demolition plan at my discretion should communication remain impossible. The authorization must come from Corps, per standing orders. But I fear the courier will not return in time. The Americans are in Bonn. They will be here within days, perhaps hours. 6th of March. The motorcycle courier has not returned. Telephone service remains interrupted. The 105th Grenadier Regiment reports American tanks advancing from Meckenheim. By my calculations, they will reach the bridge approach in less than 24 hours. I have taken the decision to prepare for immediate demolition, authorization or no authorization. The fatherland's survival depends on preventing this crossing. But the engineer officer reports a new problem. He is missing 16 men from his detachment, transferred this morning by order of division, to reinforce a position near Koblenz. The officer who delivered the transfer order could not explain why engineer troops would be sent to infantry positions. He had written orders, properly stamped. I could not refuse. We will proceed with the remaining personnel. 7th of March. Morning entry. American artillery fire all night. The engineers have completed final preparations, all charges in place and wired. But we still lack the supplemental explosives to ensure complete destruction should the primary charges fail. I have dispatched my adjutant to division headquarters in person to obtain firing authorization and additional explosives. The defenders on the West Bank report American tanks approaching. I estimate we have perhaps 4 hours. The adjutant must return. The diary ended there. Scheller never made another entry. Mitchell would later learn that Major Klaus Scheller had been killed by American machine gun fire on the bridge deck itself, trying to reach a manual firing mechanism after the electrical detonation system failed. The adjutant he had sent for authorization had been killed in an Allied air attack 5 kilometers from division headquarters, his written authorization request found on his body 2 days later. The division headquarters he had been trying to reach had evacuated westward, then eastward, then dissolved entirely as the staff officers scattered to avoid capture. None of them having replied to Scheller's increasingly desperate requests. Mitchell sat in the bunker reading Scheller's diary as evening fell on 7th of March, listening to the rumble of American trucks crossing the bridge behind him, and felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a story of American heroism, though there had been plenty of that. This wasn't even a story of German weakness, not exactly. This was a story of systemic collapse, of an army that had simply ceased to function as a coherent organization. The interrogations began the next day. American forces had captured 2,000 German soldiers in the Remagen sector in the first 48 hours, and the number was growing by hundreds each hour. Mitchell established a prisoner collection point in a converted brewery in Bad Neuenahr and began systematic interviews. What he heard there would confirm and expand the picture suggested by the documents. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, age 22, from a Volksgrenadier division that was supposed to be defending the Ahr Valley north of Remagen. I was assigned to my unit 6 weeks ago. Before that, I was in a Luftwaffe ground crew in Bavaria. They told us we were going to stop the American advance, that we would defend every town and village. But when we reached our assigned positions, there were no weapons. Well, there were weapons, but no ammunition. They told us ammunition would arrive. It never did. When the Americans came, our officers told us to fall back to the next town. Then the next town. Then we were told to cross the Rhine. But there was no bridge. The bridges had been blown. Some men tried to swim. Most were captured. Lieutenant Friedrich Becker, age 31, artillery officer from the 303rd Artillery Regiment. We were ordered to provide fire support for the bridge defense. We had 8 guns. We had ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of sustained fire. After that, nothing. The supply convoys that were supposed to bring us shells never arrived. We were told the rail yards at Bonn had been destroyed by bombing. We were told the trucks had been diverted to another sector. We were told many things. When the Americans approached, we fired what we had. It wasn't much. Then we spiked the guns and withdrew. What else could we do? Hauptmann Otto Kraus, age 38, company commander in the 11th Panzer Division. Division? What division? I commanded a company that was supposed to have 170 men. I had 42. I was supposed to have 12 armored vehicles. I had 3, and only 1 had enough fuel for more than 20 kilometers. I submitted supply requests for weeks. I received promises. The High Command issues orders as if we are still the Army of 1940, as if we have the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition, the men. We have none of these things. We have only orders and promises and propaganda telling us that wonder weapons will change everything. The only wonder is that anyone believed we could hold. The testimony accumulated. Each prisoner, each document, each captured supply ledger added another piece to the mosaic. What emerged was a portrait of an army that had reached the end of its capacity. Not fighting to the last man, as propaganda promised, but simply running out of the basic resources that made military operations possible. Mitchell compiled the data with growing astonishment. The German 15th Army, responsible for defending the central Rhine sector, was reported in German documents to have a strength of 130,000 men, based on prisoner interrogations and captured rosters. Mitchell calculated the actual strength at perhaps 55,000. And of those, possibly 30,000 were combat-effective troops, the rest being support personnel, walking wounded, or undertrained replacements. The Germans reported to higher headquarters that they possessed 420 tanks and assault guns in the Rhineland sector. Interrogation suggested the real number was closer to 90. And of those, fewer than 40 were operational at any given time due to mechanical failures and fuel shortages. German ammunition expenditure reports showed artillery units firing an average of 20 rounds per gun per day, a rate that appeared substantial until Mitchell learned that British artillery units were firing upward of 200 rounds per gun per day. The Germans weren't conserving ammunition by doctrine. They simply didn't have any more to fire. German ration strength reports indicated that the troops defending the Rhine were receiving an average of 1,800 calories per day, compared to the planned 3,000 and the 4,000 calories daily that American soldiers received. Prisoners told of hunger, of units marching for days without food, of soldiers trading military equipment for bread with German civilians. The scale became clear in the numbers. In the 6 weeks from 20th of January to 7th of March, as Allied forces cleared the west bank of the Rhine, they captured or killed approximately 290,000 German soldiers. They captured more than 1,000 artillery pieces. They destroyed or captured nearly 400 armored vehicles. But more significantly, they revealed that these forces had been operating at a fraction of their reported capability, sustained by will and propaganda rather than actual resources. And yet, the Germans had fought. That was what made the situation so stark. In some sectors, in Colmar and in parts of the Saar Basin, German units had defended fiercely, holding out for weeks despite terrible casualties. But even these defensive successes only delayed the inevitable and exhausted the last reserves of German strength. Hitler's order to hold every position at all costs wasn't a strategy for victory. It was a guarantee of complete destruction. Sergeant Robert Halsey, from the 78th Infantry Division, which had fought through the Hürtgen forest in February. We expected every town to be another Hürtgen. We expected bunkers and prepared positions and Germans fighting for every building. And sometimes we got that. But more often, we'd approach a town and the Germans would be gone. Just gone. We'd find positions they'd obviously prepared, trenches and firing points, but they'd abandoned them without a fight. At first, we thought it was some kind of trap, but it wasn't. They'd just pulled back, or tried to. We captured whole groups of them on the roads, just walking east. No organization, no officers, just walking. Private First Class James O'Connor, Reconnaissance Unit, 9th Army. The Rower Dams. Everyone said those were going to be the toughest fight. The Germans held them and they could flood the whole valley whenever they wanted. We figured we'd have to storm those dams in a direct assault. Then the Germans just blew them and retreated. Flooded the whole area, yeah, but they didn't fight for them. They could have held out for weeks, maybe months. We were ready for a bloodbath. Instead, they just left. Made us wait 2 weeks for the water to go down. But they didn't contest them. That was when I started thinking maybe things were different than we'd been told. Captain Thomas Henderson, Tank Commander, 3rd Armored Division. Cologne. We thought that was going to be Stalingrad West. A major German city. You figure the Germans are going to defend that house by house, street by street. We rolled up to the outskirts on 5th of March, expecting to spend weeks reducing the city. 2 days later, we were through it. Yeah, there was fighting. Yeah, we took casualties. But it wasn't the desperate, fanatical resistance we expected. The defenses were inconsistent. Some blocks heavily defended, some blocks empty. It felt improvised, desperate. You could tell their heart wasn't in it. Or maybe they just didn't have the means anymore. The psychological transformation happened gradually for Mitchell, spread across the weeks that followed the bridge capture as the evidence accumulated and the implications became undeniable. He spent his days reading captured documents, interviewing prisoners, compiling intelligence reports, and slowly the pattern became impossible to ignore. At first, he had tried to fit the evidence into his existing framework. The bridge at Remagen was a fortunate accident, an exceptional case. The German army was weakened, but still dangerous, still capable of mounting serious resistance. Each new piece of evidence that contradicted this, each prisoner who described supply failures and command breakdowns, each captured order that revealed the gap between German plans and German reality, Mitchell had found a way to minimize or contextualize. These are just anecdotes, he told Cordell as they reviewed prisoner interrogations in late March. We can't extrapolate from individual testimony to the entire German army. But the anecdotes kept multiplying. And they weren't just anecdotes. They were supported by documents, by supply records, by unit strength reports, by every objective measure Mitchell could apply. The German army west of the Rhine hadn't been defeated in a conventional sense. It had dissolved like salt in water. Mitchell began to have trouble sleeping. He would lie awake in his quarters, a commandeered house in Bad Neuenahr, thinking about the implications. If the German army was this broken, this exhausted, why was the war still continuing? How many more Americans would die fighting an enemy that was already defeated in all but name? He thought about the crossing of the Rhine that Montgomery was planning, the massive bombardment, the airborne drops, all predicated on facing an enemy that Mitchell was increasingly convinced no longer existed in the form Allied planning assumed. He wrote a report, 17 pages, single-spaced, documenting what he had found. The German supply situation, the actual versus reported unit strengths, the breakdown in command and control, the implications for Allied operations. He concluded, German defensive capabilities west and east of the Rhine have been systematically overestimated. The Wehrmacht is no longer capable of sustained, organized resistance on the scale our planning assumes. The primary obstacle to Allied advance is not German combat power, but German desperation and the logistical challenges of advancing through destroyed infrastructure. He submitted the report to First Army Intelligence. It was classified, circulated, and filed. Planning for the Rhine crossings continued unchanged. Montgomery's massive operation went forward as designed. On 23rd of March, Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine north of the Ruhr. 12 divisions, thousands of aircraft. The largest airborne operation since D-Day. a preparatory bombardment that consumed more ammunition than the entire British Expeditionary Force had possessed in 1940. The operation succeeded, as everyone knew it would. The Germans offered resistance, but nothing like what had been expected. The crossing succeeded at a fraction of the anticipated cost. On 24th of March, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine south of Mainz, almost as an afterthought to Montgomery's massive operation. Patton used minimal preparation, relying on speed and surprise rather than overwhelming force. His troops crossed against light resistance, established a bridgehead, and began advancing east. Patton later joked that his troops had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery, with less preparation and fewer casualties. By 25th of March, all significant German resistance west of the Rhine had ceased. The campaign that strategists had predicted would take months had taken 9 weeks. The bloodbath that planners had predicted had claimed far fewer casualties than feared. Not because the Allies had been particularly brilliant, though their coordination and logistics had been superb, but because the enemy had already been broken. Mitchell sat in his quarters on the evening of 25th of March, reading the latest situation reports. The German army was in full retreat eastward. Prisoner counts were approaching 500,000. Entire divisions were surrendering without fight. And the pattern was the same everywhere. Supply failures, command breakdowns, units that existed on paper but not in reality. Troops who had fought as long as they could with resources that had run out weeks or months ago. He pulled out Scheller's diary again, reading the entries from early March. Scheller had been a good officer, competent, dutiful, trying to do his job in an impossible situation. He had followed his orders. He had requested the resources he needed. He had tried to coordinate with higher headquarters. And at every step, the system had failed him. Not through malice or incompetence exactly, but because the system itself was no longer functioning. The German military machine, which in 1940 had conquered France in 6 weeks, had been ground down to nothing. "We were wrong about everything," Mitchell said aloud to the empty room. Not wrong about winning. The Allies were always going to win. But wrong about what winning would require. Wrong about what they were facing. Wrong about the state of the enemy. He thought about all the intelligence estimates he had written over the past year, all predicated on assumptions about German strength that had been systematically too high. He thought about the plans for the Rhine crossing that had assumed desperate resistance, the casualty estimates, the lengthy timetables, all based on fighting an army that had already ceased to exist as a functioning military organization. The irony was that the Germans had cooperated in the deception. Their propaganda kept promising fanatical resistance. Their officers kept issuing orders assuming capabilities that didn't exist. Even the German soldiers themselves, until they were actually tested, seemed to believe they would fight harder than proved possible. The whole system had been built on the pretense that Germany could still field an effective military force, and that pretense had persisted until the moment of actual contact, when it collapsed immediately and completely. Mitchell wrote a letter to his wife that night, one of the few personal letters he had written since arriving in Europe. "We have won," he wrote, "but not in the way we thought we would. The victory is complete. But it is strange to realize that the real victory happened before we even knew it. Somewhere between Normandy and the Rhine, the German army died. Not all at once, not in some decisive battle, but gradually, worn down by attrition and supply failures and the sheer overwhelming power of American production. What we've been fighting these past weeks is the ghost of the Wehrmacht, still moving, still dangerous at times, but no longer truly alive. The tragedy is that the ghost may keep fighting for weeks or months more, even though the war is already over in every meaningful sense. The broader context made the German collapse even more remarkable when Mitchell began to understand the full scope. Operation Goldflake had moved 2 entire British and Canadian divisions from Italy to northwestern Europe, transporting hundreds of thousands of men across 1,000 miles without disrupting the flow of supplies to the advancing armies. It was a logistical achievement that would have been impossible for Germany at any point in the war, and the Allies accomplished it almost as an afterthought, while simultaneously conducting the largest offensive of the European war. The prisoner processing was another case in point. 10,000 German prisoners per day at the height of the Rhineland campaign, each one requiring food, medical care, security, transportation to rear areas, interrogation, documentation. The Allies handled this flow with barely a hiccup. The logistics officers processed prisoners as efficiently as they processed supplies. Compare this to German prisoner operations in Russia, where millions of captured Soviet soldiers died from neglect and exposure because the Germans lacked the resources and organization to care for them. The contrast extended to every aspect of the campaign. American soldiers received mail from home within 2 weeks of its posting, even in forward areas. German soldiers went months without mail because the postal system had broken down. American units had mobile showers, clean uniforms, hot meals in field kitchens. German units scavenged for food and wore the same uniforms for weeks. American tanks that broke down were repaired within days or replaced immediately. German tanks that broke down were often abandoned because there were no spare parts and no means to recover them. The production numbers told the story in starker terms. In the first 3 months of 1945, American factories produced 9,000 tanks, 15,000 aircraft, and munitions in quantities that would have supplied the entire Wehrmacht for a year. German production in the same period, despite Goebbels' propaganda about miracle weapons, amounted to perhaps 1,000 tanks and 3,000 aircraft. And those that were produced often couldn't reach the front due to fuel shortages and transportation breakdowns. The structural disparity wasn't just about resources. It was about systems. The American military was designed as a machine, with standardized parts, systematic training, predictable logistics, command structures that could adapt to losses. The German military had relied on individual brilliance, on commanders who could improvise and overcome deficiencies through skill and audacity. But by 1945, the brilliance had been killed or captured, and no amount of audacity could overcome the systematic failure of supply, production, and replacement systems. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Richardson, Chief of Staff for the 7th Corps, had explained it to Mitchell one evening in late March as they reviewed the intelligence picture. The Germans keep trying to fight the war they fought in 1940. They issue orders for armored thrusts and mobile operations and coordinated defenses. But they don't have the fuel for thrusts. They don't have the radios for coordination. They don't have the trucks for mobility. So what you get is brave men with rifles trying to execute plans that require tanks and artillery and logistics they simply don't possess. It's tragic, really. They're trying to play chess while we're playing with a full deck of cards, and they're down to the 2 of clubs and the jack of spades. Mitchell had nodded, understanding. The bridge at Remagen, which had seemed like such a triumph when it was captured, was actually a symptom. The Germans hadn't failed to destroy it through bad luck or American speed. They had failed to destroy it because by March of 1945, the German army had lost the capability to execute even simple tasks that required coordination, supplies, and communication. Scheller's desperate diary entries weren't the story of one officer's misfortune. They were the story of an entire military organization's disintegration. On the 1st of April, Mitchell returned to Remagen. The bridgehead had expanded to a depth of 30 kilometers, The temporary pontoon bridges had been supplemented with semi-permanent structures. The flow of men and supplies across the Rhine had reached a rate of 50,000 tons per day. The Ludendorff Bridge itself, the original bridge that had started everything, had collapsed on 17th of March, 10 days after its capture, its damaged structure finally succumbing to the weight of traffic and the stress of German artillery fire. But by then, it didn't matter. The Rhine had been crossed. The war had moved east. Mitchell stood at the western approach, the same spot where he had stood on 7th of March, reading Major Scheller's diary. He thought about that German officer, trying desperately to do his duty, requesting authorization and supplies that would never come, watching his command structure dissolve around him, dying on the bridge deck, trying to manually detonate charges that should have been fired hours earlier. The tragedy of it struck Mitchell forcefully. Scheller and thousands of officers like him had kept fighting, kept trying to execute their orders, kept pretending that the German army was still a functioning military organization, even as the evidence of collapse mounted around them. They had believed, or forced themselves to believe, that the war could still be won, that new weapons and fresh divisions would arrive, that the Reich would rally and drive back the invaders. But the new weapons never worked, and the fresh divisions were children and old men, and the Reich was out of fuel and ammunition and food and time. A jeep pulled up, and Cordell got out, carrying another folder of documents. "More interrogation transcripts," he said. "From the Saar prisoners, same story. Supply failures, command breakdowns, units that didn't exist. You want to review them?" Mitchell shook his head. "I know what they say. I've read 50 sets of transcripts that say exactly the same thing." He looked back at the Rhine, flowing past the collapsed bridge. "The question isn't what happened. That's clear enough. The question is why it took us so long to see it." "We saw what we expected to see," Cordell said. "We expected German resistance because that's what we'd been fighting for years. We expected them to defend the Rhine because that's what any rational military force would do. We expected them to be dangerous because they had been dangerous. But somewhere along the way, between Normandy and here, they stopped being the army we were fighting and became something else. And we didn't notice because they kept going through the motions, kept fighting, kept dying, and we assumed that meant they were still capable." Mitchell nodded slowly. Major Scheller understood it. You can see it in his diary. He understood that the system had broken down, that the promises weren't going to be kept, that the supplies weren't coming. But he kept trying anyway, because what else could he do? His duty required him to defend the bridge. His orders required him to destroy it if he couldn't defend it. So he tried, even though he must have known, somewhere deep down, that it was pointless. A truck convoy rumbled past, heading east across one of the pontoon bridges. American soldiers sat in the back, young faces, confident, well-fed, well-equipped. Mitchell watched them go and thought about the German soldiers who had tried to stop them. Hungry, exhausted, fighting with weapons that didn't work and ammunition that didn't arrive, and orders that made no sense. History will record that the Allies crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, Mitchell said. It will record Montgomery's great operation, Patton's dash, the capture of the bridge at Remagen. It will make it sound like a great military achievement, a triumph of planning and execution. And it was. The logistics and coordination were magnificent. But the real story is that we crossed the Rhine because there was nothing on the other side. The German army had already collapsed. We just didn't realize it yet. "So what do we do with that knowledge?" Cordell asked. Mitchell thought about it for a long moment, watching the river. "We write accurate reports. We document what we found. and we hope that someone, someday, learns from it. Because the lesson isn't about how to defeat an enemy. We know how to do that. The lesson is about knowing when an enemy is already defeated, even when they haven't admitted it yet, even when they're still fighting. Especially when they're still fighting, because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is one who doesn't understand that they've already lost. They stood in silence for a while, 2 American officers on the bank of the Rhine, contemplating the ruins of the Wehrmacht. Behind them, the war went on. American armies drove east toward the Elbe, meeting only scattered resistance. German cities fell one after another. The prisoner counts climbed toward 1 million, and in Berlin, Hitler issued orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counteroffensives with divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier, promising victory with resources that had run out months ago. The bridge at Remagen, which should have fallen into the river on 7th of March, had stood just long enough to reveal the truth that Mitchell had spent the past 3 weeks documenting. That the Wehrmacht had fought itself to extinction, that the war had been decided not on the battlefield, but in the factories and farms and coal mines and rail yards, that German courage and German skill had been ground to nothing against the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied war machine, and that what remained was not an army, but a memory, still dangerous, still lethal, but already dead. Mitchell picked up the folder of new interrogation transcripts, tucked it under his arm. There would be more reports to write, more prisoners to interview, more documentation to compile. The intelligence officer's work never ended, but now he understood what he was documenting. Not a military campaign, but an autopsy. The examination of how an army died, not in some dramatic last stand, but through the slow strangulation of logistics and supply and systemic collapse. It was, in its way, more complete a victory than any battlefield triumph could have been. As they walked back to the jeep, Cordell asked, "Do you think they knew? The German High Command, I mean. Do you think they understood how broken their army really was?" Mitchell considered the question. Some of them must have. You can't hide the truth completely, not when the evidence is that overwhelming. But understanding the truth and accepting it are different things. I think they knew, but they couldn't admit it, not even to themselves. Because admitting it would mean admitting that everything they'd fought for, all the sacrifices, all the deaths, were for nothing. It's easier to keep fighting, keep pretending, keep issuing orders to armies that don't exist. That way, you can tell yourself you never surrendered. You just ran out of time. He looked back once more at the river, at the place where the Ludendorff Bridge had stood, the bridge that should not have been standing, the bridge whose survival had revealed more than any intelligence report could have. It had shown that the German army, for all its reputation and all its propaganda, had reached the end. Not the end of its courage, not the end of its will to fight, but the end of its capacity to function as a modern military organization. And in total war, capacity was everything. The jeep started, and they drove east, following the advancing armies into Germany. Behind them, the Rhine flowed on, indifferent to the armies that crossed it, indifferent to the nations that rose and fell on its banks, indifferent to the truths that Mitchell had discovered in the wreckage of German military power. The river would still be there long after the war ended, long after the last prisoners were released and the last reports filed and the last lessons learned or forgotten. But for now, on this April day in 1945, it marked the boundary between what had been and what would be, between the illusion of German strength and the reality of German collapse, between the war as it was imagined and the war as it actually was.